So we don't cease to have ever more interesting speakers. This is our last speaker before the coffee break. So we'll, no need to hurry through this, but we'll be able to look forward to a cup of coffee after you. This is Katie McLaughlin, and she's the Ruane Prize winner today for Outstanding Achievement in Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. Katie is remarkable. She has really spent all of her time on the East Coast at Yale and Harvard for her training and for her early academic life. And then she just a month ago, 2 months ago, a very short time ago, moved to the Balmer Institute in the at the University of Oregon. So she's used to live right on the edge of the Atlantic Ocean. Now she lives right on the edge of the Pacific Ocean. She's a clinical psychologist, and her focus has been in early childhood trauma. And we've heard references, although not a full explanation, to early childhood trauma and how important it is. Her previous research has shown that there's really two aspects of childhood trauma that are most important to the child. One is the aspects of threat, and the other one is the aspects of deprivation. And she has done extraordinary research, very productive research with all of these aspects of early childhood trauma. She's published an awfully lot. I should be able to tell you how many papers, but there's over 320 papers in the first 15 years of her career, which has been remarkable, with an H-index of 113, which I'll just tell you for those who don't know is very high. The NIMH has been very well funded by NIMH all of her career. And at one of her last grants that did very well, the NIMH actually, in addition to funding the 5 years worth of the grant, they gave her an extra 5 years. I think they must have just understood that it wouldn't do any good to re-review you again in 5 years, but they would just give you 10 years all at the same time. Katie McLaughlin, welcome to BBRF.
Thanks, Carol. Well, thank you for that kind introduction, Carol. Huge thanks to BBRF for this incredible honor, and thanks to all of you who are here today for your support of BBRF. So the work that I'm going to talk with you about today focuses on how experiences of trauma in childhood, along with other forms of adversity, can alter the way the brain develops in ways that ultimately place children at risk for mental illness. Oops. Okay, so I'm going to use the word childhood adversity throughout the talk today. I'm going to take just a moment to explain what I mean by that. So when I use this term, I'm talking about experiences in the environment that happen during childhood and adolescence that we might consider to be significant stressors. So they're either severe or they're experiences that go on for a period of time, they're chronic, and they're likely to require adaptation by an average child. They often represent a deviation from what we consider to be the expectable environment, the environment our brains expect to encounter in early life. And they often involve experiences like threat, being exposed to something that's dangerous, that could harm you, or deprivation and absence of something that our brain expects to encounter during development, or some kind of loss. And while thinking about these terms, you might be thinking to yourself, well, those experiences are probably pretty rare. But in fact, we've shown that they're actually quite common among children, not only in the US, but throughout the world. So what I'm showing you here are data from a nationally representative sample of about 10,000 children and adolescents here in the US. And what you see here are different forms of early life adversity. Some of these are interpersonal loss events, like having a parent die, other forms of parental separation, like the situation that's unfolded on our southern border over the past few years, indicators of parental maladjustment, like growing up in a family where your parents are violent towards one another, and then more intense or severe indicators of child maltreatment, like abuse and neglect. And what you might notice is that the prevalence of these different experiences varies quite a lot, but on the whole, more than half of all kids in this country will experience at least one of these events by the time they reach adulthood. And we know that these experiences also cluster. So kids who experience one of these forms of adversity are likely to experience many others. And so what I'm showing you here is data from that same nationally representative study For each of these forms of adversity, what you see are the average number of additional adversities a child experienced. And the average here is actually 3.5. So every kid who experiences one of these forms of adversity is likely to experience many others. Now, what I'm going to talk to you about today are the consequences of these experiences for mental health, the way that they can change brain development and ways that contribute to mental health problems. But we also know that these experiences of early life adversity can also increase your risk for chronic diseases, for obesity, like what Roger was talking about, and even early mortality. And what I'll talk about is some of our recent work that shows that these experiences might actually accelerate the pace at which your body is aging at a cellular level, which might be one key mechanism that contributes to this risk, both for increased levels of mental health and physical health problems. Okay, so I'm gonna start by talking a little bit about mental health. Now, I taught courses at Harvard for many years about stress. And what I used to teach my students was that if you could know just one thing about somebody and you wanted to predict whether they might develop a mental health problem, what you would want to know is whether they had experienced one of these forms of childhood adversity. They are incredibly powerful predictors of the onset of psychopathology. So I'll show you an example. This is data, again, from this large, nationally representative study of 10,000 kids and their parents. And what you see here are the number of those adversities that I showed you a few slides ago, and the likelihood that that someone develops a psychiatric disorder, anxiety, depression, ADHD, a substance use problem, by the time they reach adulthood. And what you see is this powerful dose-response relationship where as adversity increases, the likelihood that you develop a mental disorder increases substantially, with kids here at the highest levels of exposure being nearly 5 times as likely to develop a mental disorder as kids who have never experienced adversity. This is a powerful association. So what I'm going to talk to you about is why this powerful association exists. So why are kids who experience trauma and adversity more likely to develop psychopathology, and what are some of the mechanisms that underlie that? Specifically, I'm going to talk about the way that these experiences, some examples of how they might change the way the brain is developing in ways that contribute to risk for mental illness. And so the point I want to make here is that childhood and adolescence are periods of heightened brain plasticity. And what that means is that our brain is particularly likely to be influenced by our environment early in life. And this is actually a good thing. This helps us to sculpt a brain that is maximally adapted to the environment in which we're developing. This helps children learn and adapt to their environments. But it can also come at a cost for kids who are exposed to environments that are stressful or traumatic, because the brain may be particularly likely to be changed by those experiences when they happen early in life. So what I'm going to do is show you a couple examples of our work linking experiences of childhood trauma to changes in brain function and brain structure. Okay, so for the rest of the talk, I'm going to focus on our work among kids who've been exposed to trauma. When I use that term, what I mean are experiences that involve harm or threat of harm to actually your physical safety. So these are kids who have been exposed to violence, they've been exposed to abuse in their homes, or other kinds of violence, either at home or in their neighborhoods. And the idea I'd like you to remember is that growing up in an environment that's dangerous shifts the way that your brain processes information in a way that prioritizes the identification of threat in the environment. What I'd also like you to remember is that this is exactly what you might want your brain to do if you were growing up in an environment that's dangerous. This helps you to identify danger in the environment in ways that might help to protect you and keep you safe, at least in the moment. But it might come at a long-term cost. So let me give you a few examples. So one of the most common patterns that we see among kids who've been exposed to trauma is changes in the function of the amygdala. The way that we have studied this is by bringing kids in, putting them in an MRI scanner, and then exposing them to stimuli that suggest the presence of danger in the environment. So we might show them faces that are exhibiting fear relative to faces that are neutral. Now, if somebody's exhibiting fear, that's a pretty good sign that something dangerous might be happening around you, right? Or we might show them images like this, people engaged in conflict or situations that involve actual danger relative to situations that are neutral. And what you see across these paradigms is that among kids who've been exposed to trauma, relative to those who have not, we see substantially elevated response in the amygdala. Now, People hear the amygdala, they often think fear. That's the brain area associated with fear. But what the amygdala actually does is respond to salience in the environment, things that are important to pay attention to because they're relevant for our goals. Now, for most of us, for everyone, survival at base is our most important goal. So anything that has relevance for survival is going to activate this region of the brain. And so what we see here is that cues that signify danger are activating a much higher salience response in kids who've been exposed to trauma, who have grown up in environments that are actually dangerous. Now, in the short term, this might be adaptive. The amygdala projects out to the peripheral nervous system. It helps you to mobilize responses to stay safe, but it can come at a long-term cost for your mental health. So I'm just going to show you one example. There have been many, many studies now linking this elevated response in the amygdala to threat to risk for mental health problems later. We had a really interesting opportunity to study this in the context of actually one of the very first studies I did of children who'd been exposed to trauma and the brain that was funded by BBRF. This was a study done in my lab in Boston, at Harvard, and in the midst of this study, a terrorist attack happened in Boston. You all might remember the 2013 marathon bombing that happened in Boston. 2 pressure cooker bombs were detonated at the finish line of the marathon. Several people were killed, many hundreds were injured. And although direct exposure to this event was limited to folks who were standing at the finish line of the marathon when the bombs were detonated, for those of us who were living in Boston at the time, the city was on really high alert for the ensuing weeks. The public transportation system was filled with National Guard members. Multiple areas of downtown Boston were roped off as crime scenes. And the media speculated widely about additional bombs in Fenway Park and the JFK Library that, of course, didn't materialize. And a few days after the bombs went off, a massive manhunt for the perpetrators unfolded through neighborhoods around the Boston area, and the entire city was shut down for that day. Schools were closed, public transportation system was closed, everyone was inside glued to CNN watching these events unfold on television. And what we learned during 9/11 is that exposure to these kinds of traumatic terrorist attacks, even just through the media, can trigger symptoms of PTSD in children. And so what we were curious about is whether this pattern of brain activity that we had just happened to collect right before this exogenous traumatic event happened would predict which kids develop symptoms of PTSD. And in fact, it did quite strongly. So the more that your amygdala mobilized a response to those threat cues, the more likely you were to develop symptoms of PTSD in response to this terrorist attack. Okay, so let me give you one other example of how childhood trauma can impact the way the brain develops. So a second really common finding in our research and the research of others is that trauma can impact the structure and function of the hippocampus. So this is a region we often associate with learning and memory, but it's also a central node in one of our key stress response systems in the body. It actually helps to shut off the stress response. What we know from animal models is that chronic exposure to stress can actually damage the neurons in this region of the brain, in the hippocampus, causing it to shrink. You can actually see this region of the brain become smaller in animals who have been exposed to chronic stress. And what we have seen repeatedly in our work, and the work of others, is that being exposed to trauma in childhood is associated with reductions in the size of the hippocampus. So you see this quite clearly here. These are the bars of kids who've been exposed to trauma. These are the kids who have not been exposed to trauma. This region of the brain actually becomes smaller when you're exposed to these kinds of events early in life. And this is concerning because we know this is a critical region of the brain that underlies learning and memory. It's associated with performance in school. But we also see that it is strongly related to risk for depression in particular. So people who have a smaller hippocampus are at greater risk for developing depression, especially when they encounter additional stressful life events. And you can see that here just in one example of a longitudinal study that looked at the volume of the hippocampus and the likelihood of developing depression over a several-year period of time. And what I want you to focus on is this red line. These are the folks who had reduced hippocampal volume, and they also experienced early life adversity. So you can see that the folks most likely to develop depression over time not only had that experience of early life stress, but in combination with this reduction in the size of the hippocampus was a really potent risk factor for developing depression. Okay. So those were just two examples. Our work has identified many other ways in which growing up in an environment characterized by stress and adversity can change the way the brain develops, leading to changes in your prefrontal cortex, in networks that involve the prefrontal cortex, the frontoparietal network, which is associated with executive function, long-term decision-making, networks in the brain that respond to reward, which Roger talked a bit about in his talk. And in all of these cases, we see that these changes in the brain, while they may be adaptive in the short term in terms of helping children deal with challenging environments, they come at a long-term cost in terms of increasing their risk for a wide range of mental health problems, ADHD, depression, anxiety, as well as difficulties in school. Okay, I want to pivot just for a moment and talk a little bit about some of the consequences that these early life experiences can have for physical health, not only mental health. And I think Roger touched on this nicely throughout his talk. This looks really similar to the graph I showed you at the beginning in terms of the link between adversity and mental health. What this is showing you is the link between adversity in childhood and the likelihood that you develop chronic diseases as an adult. Things like hypertension, diabetes, cancer, cardiovascular disease. And you see this same dose-response relationship where as exposure to adversity increases, so does the likelihood of developing these chronic diseases as an adult. Now, the mechanisms that underlie this are complex. They involve changes in metabolism, the immune system, health behavior, stress response systems. I'm just going to give you one example of some recent work from our lab and the labs of others showing that these experiences early in life might actually accelerate the pace at which your body ages, contributing to risk not only for physical health problems, but also mental health problems. So as an early example, this is data from a large nationally representative sample. What I'm showing you here are just girls. And what we looked at was the number of traumatic events these girls had experienced early in life and the age at which they reached menarche. And what you see is a systematic relationship where girls who had experienced more trauma are actually reaching puberty at an earlier age than their peers. And this is after controlling for a whole host of things like race, ethnicity, and family income, and BMI that we know are associated with the timing of puberty. We've replicated this in a number of studies. So in a separate study in my lab, we looked at how exposure to trauma was related to the pace of pubertal development, how fast you were going through puberty relative to your peers. And we find the same positive relationship. The more trauma you experience in childhood, not only do you get to puberty earlier, but you accelerate through puberty faster than your peers. And in that same study, we were also able to measure a marker of cellular aging. And this is kind of a complicated measure, but it uses methylation tags across your genome to create a biological clock. That's a measure of how fast the cells in your body are aging. And what we see is that the more trauma you experience as a child, the faster your cells were aging at a biological level, suggesting that across multiple biological systems, early life trauma might accelerate the pace at which your body is aging. So these were a few studies from my lab, but we wanted to take a look at this across many studies that have been done on this topic. So this is a meta-analysis with over 100,000 individuals included. And what you see across all of these studies is that across more than 100,000 kids, we see that on average, exposure to trauma accelerates the timing of puberty. It means you get to puberty earlier and you go through puberty faster than your peers. And although there's been much less work in this area, we see this effect consistently as well for cellular aging. That across many studies, or all the studies that have been done, a handful of studies, kids who've been exposed to trauma seem to be exhibiting faster aging even at a cellular level. And we know this is concerning because actually this accelerated rate of aging has been associated with many kinds of mental health problems. Getting to puberty earlier is associated with increased risk for depression, anxiety, externalizing behaviors. But we know it also predicts the onset of cardiovascular disease, cancer, and even premature mortality, suggesting that this accelerated aging may be a key mechanism that contributes both to mental health problems as well as physical health problems in kids who've experienced adversity. But I'd like to end on a more positive note. So I told you at the beginning of this talk that childhood and adolescence are periods of increased brain plasticity, meaning that we're particularly sensitive to our environments during these periods of early life. And that can come at a cost if you've been exposed to adversity, but it also means that these are key sensitive periods for intervention. for our attempting to intervene early to prevent the onset of mental health problems in kids who have had these experiences. Now, I don't have time to talk about this research in detail, but over the past 5 years or so, we've been working to translate this basic research into early intervention. So both Phil and Roger talked about prevention, the importance of starting to shift our focus in psychiatry away from only doing treatment studies to think about how do we prevent mental health problems from emerging in the first place. This is work I've done in close collaboration with Joan Luby, who actually won the Ruane Prize last year, I believe, from BBRF. And we've been translating some of these mechanisms to identify kids both in pediatric primary care settings and in schools that are located in neighborhoods that have high rates of exposure to violence and adversity, to deliver these early interventions that target some of these mechanisms to try to prevent the onset of mental health problems in these kids. And we've had very promising results from our early work on this topic. But I want to leave you with one final idea. We can deliver interventions at the individual level and reach however many kids our funders will allow us to reach when we conduct those studies. But we have even more effective levers that we can pull. So this is a study we published just this year. We used data from a huge nationally representative sample called the ABCD study of over 11,000 teenagers in this country that measured aspects of brain structure and function as well as their environments. And what we see in this study is that poverty and lower family income are associated, like I showed you earlier with trauma, with smaller hippocampal volume as well as higher rates of anxiety and depression in kids. That's not a surprise. We've seen that in many, many prior studies. But what we found, so this study is interesting in that the kids are dispersed across more than 20 states in the country. We actually found that these disparities in brain structure and mental health were reduced significantly by as much to 1/3 in terms of brain development and 1/2 in terms of mental health in states that had more generous social safety nets for low-income families. So in states that have policies that help to protect kids from the negative consequences of growing up in a family with low income or growing up in a violent neighborhood, we're much less likely to see these changes in the brain as well as risk for mental health problems. And I highlight this because this is something really tractable. This is something that we as a society can actually accomplish in terms of preventing some of these long-term consequences of early life adversity for both brain development as well as mental health. So thank you to all of you for your attention. Thanks to BBRF for the opportunity to be here. And thank you to my funders. Yeah. Yes. In the back?
Thank you for your work. It's fascinating. But I have a question.
Yes.
When you are looking at these children who are traumatized, nobody looks at how they perceive the world. Because I work with families with children with mental illness, and there are siblings, and they have the same experience, and one child is traumatized, and the other child is not. And so we have been looking at precursors to, if you ever read Viktor Frankl's book on people who were in the Holocaust, how he could determine who was going to survive and who wasn't. I think we're making a big mistake by not looking at what abilities and capacities do children have when they are born. What is their sensitivity to perceptual things, to somatosensory? Because there are some children who are prone to high threat perception from the get-go.
Yeah.
And falling down and getting a knee injury is as traumatic as going through a divorce or being raped.
Yeah.
And if we don't make that distinction, we put everybody in this trauma category, and it scares me because then everything is somebody else's fault.
Yeah, it's a great question, and thank you for asking it. And what you're raising is something we see quite consistently in this field, which is enormous variability And so what I showed you were averages. On average, if you've been exposed to trauma, you're more likely to develop mental health problems. But we see many kids who've been exposed to serious adversity who exhibit resilience, who don't go on to develop mental health problems. And there's actually a whole field devoted to the study of resilience. What is it that creates that vulnerability for some kids, whereas for others, we see this resilience? And one of the things you mentioned, the way we make attributions about why something happened, about the cause of the trauma, is one source of resilience, but there are many. And two things that I like to highlight that seem to be the most consistent sources of resilience across studies is that kids who have even just one adult in their life who they feel is supportive, that they can go to talk about their problems, that is emotionally responsive. It doesn't have to be a parent, doesn't have to even be someone in your family. It could be a coach, a teacher, a religious figure. Just one adult has an enormous protective effect against some of these long-term consequences of adversity. And there's lots of more, lots of other factors that might be important. So some of the recent work we've been doing actually suggests that kids who are really sensitive to positive things in their environment, so you mentioned kids who are sensitive to negative things. Of course, those kids tend to be more vulnerable. But actually, kids who are really sensitive to reward, kids who are more likely to shift their behavior around to obtain a reward, seem to be protected from developing some of these negative mental health consequences of adversity. And so there's an enormous amount of work that seeks to translate that work on resilience into interventions. How can we capitalize on understanding which kids do not develop mental health problems following adversity to develop more effective interventions?
In terms of somebody's comment about the silos in psychiatry, I'm astonished that we do this enormous amount in genetic work and we don't apply the genetics and the field of evolutionary psychiatry to what are they starting out with. And if we started to measure sensitivity and things like this in infants and babies, we'd have a bigger head start than looking for the trauma, because trauma is creating an enormous amount of families whose kids are told that their family is toxic and they should go away from their family. Mm-hmm. And I think that's doing enormous harm.
Yeah, well, there's a study launching right now called the HBCD study, the infant version of the adolescent study I just described to you, where they're going to recruit 10,000 actually pregnant women and follow their infants over a 10-year period to do exactly what you're describing, to really understand those early roots of I'm sorry? You got it. Yeah, it is, yes. There was a question in the back.
Hi, thank you for a fascinating discussion. I wonder if there is a way to quantify the existential traumas that children today, after COVID, 2 wars now going on, climate change, is there a way to do it, and is there a need to sort of do that as opposed to the sort of socioeconomic traumas that everyone is familiar with?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. Thanks for raising it. And what I'll say is that folks who work in child and adolescent psychiatry have been, asking this very question as we watch the rates of mental health problems among young people skyrocket over the past decade. And this was a trend that started before the pandemic. We've been seeing the rates of depression, anxiety, suicidal behaviors among children and adolescents steadily rise over the past decade, and that trend was just accelerated during the pandemic. And while it's tough to identify causal factors, what exactly is causing this, one of the things that many people have speculated is that it's exactly the sorts of environmental stressors and traumatic events that many, many more kids are exposed to, in part because of social media. Not that the social media is causing it, but when a traumatic event happens, a police shooting, a racially motivated, police crime, suddenly everyone can see that. There's a video that people can share around the world, so it's exposing young people to these events in a very intimate and personal way. And of course, we don't know, is that the cause of the increase in mental health problems, but it's something that people have really speculated, and I think it's an area that people are really starting to explore more deeply. With climate change, as you also mentioned, being one area that many young people are coming to mental health professionals saying that the reason they're feeling so anxious is about climate change and their inability to do something about this. And so the sort of intersection of climate change with psychiatry is really a brand new field that we know very little about, but requires a lot more research. And I suspect BBRF is probably funding studies on that topic already. Yes, we had some questions in the front. Yeah, right here. Sorry, do we have time? Yeah.
Let me slip in a question.
Yeah, sure.
You talk specifically about the resilience treatment in childhood. Would that, does the usefulness of that run out as you get older? Should we be thinking about using that same kind of resilience treatment in adults?
It's a great question, and actually the National Institute on Aging has convened really a whole section of that funding body to focus on what they call reversibility of the effects of early life adversity on health and wellness later in life, to see if the same kinds of interventions we've been using in kids might have some benefit later in life as well. So it's a great question. Yeah.
What are your thoughts on using positive stress to increase resilience?
Yeah, so the question was positive stress as a way of increasing resilience. And it's a great question because, one of the things that gets lost when we talk about trauma and stress is we sort of just assume as stress goes up, mental health goes up. And that's what you saw in the graph I showed you when we're talking about these more extreme forms of stress, like being exposed to violence. But one of the things I find most interesting is that only very recently have folks revealed that the relationship between stress and mental health is actually a J-shaped curve. And what that means is actually people whose mental health is the best are people who have a moderate amount of stress. They're not people who have never experienced stress at all, but stressors that are, that are within our grasp to navigate, that can teach us coping resources, that can give us some mastery, that when bad things happen, we have the ability to manage it and we can cope. That level of stress actually seems to be adaptive, and that folks who have never experienced any stress at all actually look worse in terms of their mental health. So absolutely, I think there's ways that we can think about not trying, for example, to protect our kids from all kinds of stress, but allowing them to experience disappointment and frustrations and challenges so that they learn the skills to cope with the inevitable stressors that they will face in the future. Absolutely. Yeah, and then maybe one more? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay.
2 more questions.
2 more.
Yeah, so when you were talking about the hippocampus, that region of the brain, right?
Yes.
And you talked about how it reduces in size based on the amount of stress a person experiences. So my question is there ever a time when the brain can actually regain the volume that it either had before, or whatever is a healthy size of that area in the brain?
It's a great question. And so the hippocampus is a region of the brain where we see a lot of ongoing plasticity into adulthood. So there are continual changes in the structure of this region. And what's so interesting, we actually don't have great human data on this, but in animal models, what you see is if you expose rodents to chronic stress early in life, we see this, shrinking in the hippocampus that stays fairly stable over time. Now, they're following these rodents for relatively short periods of time, but what's interesting is if they do the same thing in adulthood, you see a temporary decrease in the size of this region that then increases again once the stressor ends. So the answer is yes, there is plasticity in this region. None of the effects that I showed you are necessarily permanent, right? The brain is remarkably plastic. Even into adulthood, we continue to see plasticity in these regions, which means that interventions, positive experiences, have the ability to change our brain in positive ways as well. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk. My question is, and she asked a perfect preceding question, is what kind of studies are being done around mindfulness-based stress reduction, meditation, yoga, all those kind of interventions and their impact on the structure of the brain?
That's a great question. I would say, I'm not enormously familiar with that literature. There's an expert at MGH who used to be a colleague of mine who had done some of the very first studies on mindfulness-based stress reduction and the brain. And actually what's interesting, so to your question about the hippocampus, some of those early studies showed that people who engaged in a mindfulness-based stress reduction intervention over a 12-week period actually showed small increases in the volume of the hippocampus. And that work has been extended, I know, to show also effects on the amygdala, which we talked about earlier. there's changes in the reactivity of the amygdala to threatening stimuli. So this is an area of great interest, and I know folks have been quite interested in how mindfulness and meditation might be an intervention that could be used for kids or adults who have experienced adversity as kids as a potential intervention. Yeah. Thanks so much.
My suggestion is that we take say thanks to Dr. McLaughlin.